And we're on. So Nicholas, take it away.
All right. And you see the doc. Yep. Okay. Let me zoom in. All right. So we basically got some feedback. Well, you have pointed out that the way we were considering shipping drop entries count could be a bit confusing. So first, let me explain what it is, just as a recap, since we've talked about it here before. So when you use Performance Observer, you can use the buffered flag to get entries that were created before you begin observing. But there is a limit to the number of entries that the user agent will store, simply because we don't want to just keep storing forever, especially to prevent like unbounded memory use of these entries, and just in general prevent too much memory from being occupied for when they're not going to be accessed by the website. So we have a max buffer size, and we have suggested numbers for each in the registry. But developers have asked us to basically make it easier to know when these buffers have become full, as this could potentially be a problem in cases such as long-lived sites, or cases where the site just loads a lot of content, or maybe, well, depending on what kind of entry. For example, for resource timing, if they load too many resources, then you could potentially hit that buffer limit. Or if you shift all the time, you could also potentially hit the layout shift buffer limit, for example. So in order to satisfy that use case, we worked on droppedEntriesCount, which is basically provided by the observer callback. Let's see. So in the callback, when you receive entries, you would receive the droppedEntriesCount, which just represents how many entries are dropped for that observer, basically for the entries being observed by that observer, if that makes sense. So what's the confusion? The confusing part about this, the potential problem, is that if this number is surfaced on every callback, then it could be potentially confusing if developers see that the count increases even though they have been observing entries. Because the way it works is that once your buffer size is full, then it starts increasing. So it's basically a value that is computed for each frame, independent of the observer itself. So a developer that looks at it later on will be like, why did I drop entries when my initial callback told me that I didn't drop any entries? So given that the main use case is to know if you dropped entries before you started observing, then we considered just populating the value only in the first callback after the observe call from the performance observer. So we partnered with WebDevInsights, which allowed us to survey web developers. And so the survey size was 272 developers. And we tried to filter out those that are unfamiliar with the concept of performance observer. So I wanted to highlight some of the results we obtained from the survey. So the majority, 90% of the respondents who work with performance observers say that they're easy to work with, although 10% say they're hard. Only 71% of respondents use the buffered flag, with 52% using it sometimes, which is interesting. And only 19% using it always. So that's interesting insight. Yeah, I wonder if it's related to the fact that it's relatively new and they hear web compatibility issues with the flag, or not sure what's going on there. Then 87% of the people responding to questions said that it would be moderately valuable to surface what we're proposing, which is the number of entries that exceeded the buffer before the observer was registered. And we also asked about the naming, which we had a bit of back and forth in the tag review. And we found that the majority, 52%, found the name we chose, which is droppedEntriesCount, to be clearer. And we compared that with something like total droppedEntriesCount and total entries count. So basically, we were trying to do this survey to determine what is the clearest way to surface the information, so that the developers that want to use it can tell us if certain buffer sizes are too big or too small. We think that the best path forward is to ship the simpler version based on the responses that we're seeing, because this method is already a little bit, sorry, what this value is already a little bit complicated to explain. And so, like, as you see, I took several minutes to explain what we're doing. And so we think we should just aim for simplicity. And so in the first callback, we would expose a number. And in subsequent callbacks, we would basically just not expose it, or basically it would just return null or 0, whatever. Obviously, unless you call observe again, which I guess is an edge case, because most of the time you just call observe once with an observer. But so that is the result of the survey. And yeah, Michael.
Sorry, just on the topic of registering a second observer, it might be an edge case for you.
Michael, just 1 second. I'll stop recording and then we can move over to the discussion.